I was sitting in my Ford pickup across the street when the real estate agent planted the sold sign on my front lawn. 24 hours after my son William had told me he was handling some paperwork to make things easier for my retirement. The house I'd built with my own hands in 1987. The house where my late wife Margaret had tended her roses for 32 years. The house William had just sold without my knowledge while I was supposedly visiting my sister in Ohio. In that moment, it didn't feel like they were selling a house. It felt like they were selling the last 30 years of my life right in front of me. But I hadn't gone to Ohio. I'd been watching from this truck for 3 days, ever since I'd discovered the real estate listing online. My own address, my own house, listed by Family Estate Management with a closing date that had apparently happened this morning. William stood on the porch, shaking hands with strangers who were already measuring my living room windows for new curtains. His wife, Carol, counted what appeared to be a substantial check, while their teenage son, Kevin, loaded boxes from my garage into their SUV. They thought I was 2 states away, confused and manageable, and what I saw from that truck was only the beginning of a betrayal deeper than I ever imagined. If you've ever been treated like you're too old to understand, you already know how a sentence like that cuts. They had no idea what I'd learned about their plan, or what I'd been doing while they thought I was safely out of the way. It had really started 6 months earlier, when William first suggested I was getting too old to maintain such a large property. 6 months earlier, William had started bringing Carol to our weekly dinners with what he called practical conversations about my living situation. Every discussion seemed to drift toward my supposed inability to handle basic household maintenance. Dad's been struggling with simple repairs, William had mentioned during one gathering, gesturing around my kitchen. Last week he called me about a leaky faucet he could have fixed himself 10 years ago. Yesterday he seemed confused about his property tax deadlines. None of that was accurate. The faucet had been a complex valve issue that required a plumber. The property tax confusion was his invention. I'd handled my finances independently for 7 decades. Carol would nod sympathetically during these discussions, occasionally adding observations about my obvious decline and the burden of maintaining such a large property alone. Dad really should consider downsizing, she'd say, reviewing what appeared to be assisted living brochures she'd thoughtfully brought along. These communities offer so much support and social interaction. Plus, the equity from the house would provide excellent financial security. What I didn't understand then was that they weren't just concerned about my welfare. They were building justification for decisions they'd apparently already made. Most people would have walked away at this point, but something in me refused to stay silent. Looking back, I should have known the real trouble started when William offered to help organize my important papers last month. What William didn't realize was that his father wasn't just Thomas, retired construction foreman who'd spent 40 years building houses around our small community. I'd always been observant, always noticed details that others missed, always understood when people were performing rather than being genuine. The conversation that changed everything happened 3 weeks ago when I returned from grocery shopping to find William, Carol, and a man introduced as Richard, a family friend who works in estate planning, sitting in my living room with legal documents spread across my coffee table. Dad, Richard has some suggestions about protecting your assets, William had said, not quite meeting my eyes. With property values rising, there are tax implications and inheritance considerations we should address while you're still able to make clear decisions. Richard stepped forward with what appeared to be standard estate planning paperwork. Mr. Thomas, these arrangements would transfer property ownership to family members while allowing you to remain in residence. It's a common strategy for protecting assets from potential medical costs or facility fees. I recognized the subtle pressure tactics they were using, the artificial urgency about making decisions while I was still capable, the emotional manipulation disguised as financial protection. These arrangements are perfectly standard, Richard explained, presenting documents that appeared legitimate. The transfer would be purely administrative. Nothing would change about your daily life, but your family would be protected from potential complications. Something about their coordination felt rehearsed, calculated in ways that reminded me of techniques I'd seen used on vulnerable elderly people throughout my community. I only realized later what that small detail really meant when I noticed Richard's business card listed a different name than the one he'd given me. That evening, I discovered what William and Carol had been planning by carefully reviewing documents they'd left behind. Property transfer forms with my signature forged, power of attorney paperwork with predetermined conclusions, real estate consultation records showing they'd already obtained property valuations. Each document I read felt like another small funeral for the life Margaret and I had built. William had been working systematically with Carol and Richard to create a legal framework for gaining control of my house, the property I'd owned free and clear for 36 years, now worth approximately $650,000 according to their appraisal documents. Asset transfer generates substantial equity for family financial planning, Carol had noted in her handwriting. Property sale proceeds, provides security for retirement facility placement while eliminating maintenance responsibilities. But their scheme extended beyond simple property theft. Carol had been researching senior living communities that specialized in housing elderly, residents whose family members controlled their finances, facilities designed to provide comprehensive care while family members managed complex financial decisions. Monthly facility costs range from $8,000 to $12,000, William had calculated in documents I found. Property sale proceeds would cover expenses while providing surplus for family investment opportunities. The scope of betrayal was breathtaking, but William had miscalculated something crucial about his target. What truly revealed their timeline was a calendar notation I found. Property closing. Dad in Ohio. William made his fatal mistake when he assumed I would actually travel to Ohio to visit my sister as planned. Instead, I'd called Margaret's sister to cancel, then positioned myself to observe what they'd do during my supposed absence. Thomas isn't going anywhere this week, I'd told my sister-in-law Helen, but William doesn't need to know that. What William didn't know was that I'd spent 40 years in construction management, which meant I understood property law, contract procedures, and real estate fraud better than he realized. I recognized every violation in their forged documentation. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man. They forgot I'd spent 40 years solving problems they couldn't even spell. The property transfer documents contained procedural irregularities, I confirmed while reviewing their paperwork with my longtime attorney James. Forged signatures, falsified notarization, power of attorney claims that exceed legal authority. James had been handling my legal affairs for 23 years. He understood immediately what William and Carol had attempted. This represents systematic real estate fraud, James explained during our confidential meeting. Forged property transfer, identity theft, elder financial abuse. We're looking at multiple felony violations. The proof stacked up faster than I could process it. William had created fraudulent documentation that might deceive most elderly homeowners, but he'd made critical legal errors that any experienced attorney would identify immediately. The real estate agent appears to be complicit, James noted while reviewing their sales documentation. Proceeding with property sale based on forged authorization, accepting fraudulent power of attorney claims. William had attempted real estate fraud against someone whose career had been devoted to understanding property law and construction contracts. Anyone who's ever been underestimated because of their age knows exactly why I kept fighting. From the cab of my pickup, I saw everything they tried to hide as they celebrated completing the sale, and that was the moment their guilt was confirmed. I knew William's scheme was finished when James contacted the district attorney's real estate fraud division. The investigation expanded rapidly once we'd reported systematic property theft involving forged legal documentation. Thomas, we've identified a comprehensive criminal conspiracy, Detective Sarah explained during our meeting at James's office. Fraudulent property transfer, forged legal documents, systematic preparation for asset theft through manipulated power of attorney claims. I kept asking myself the same question. When did my own son start seeing me as an obstacle instead of a father? Every page confirmed a truth I didn't want to believe. William had collaborated with Carol and Richard to create fraudulent documentation, targeting not just my property, but my fundamental legal rights as a homeowner. We've discovered the real estate agent has been involved in similar schemes, Detective Sarah added. Richard isn't actually an estate planning attorney. His credentials are fraudulent. They've been targeting elderly homeowners throughout the county. I spread additional evidence across James's desk, Copies of William's correspondence with senior facilities, Carol's financial projections, Richard's fake credentials, the forged property documents that had supposedly authorized the sale. The property sale is legally invalid, James confirmed. Forged authorization, fraudulent power of attorney, identity theft. Any court would void this transaction immediately. What William didn't understand was that stealing someone's house requires more than just forging a few signatures. It requires legal expertise he didn't possess. What truly sealed his fate was when he deposited the sale proceeds into accounts I was already monitoring. That week, I observed William's confidence begin deteriorating as legal complications emerged. The property buyers discovered irregularities in the title transfer. The real estate agency received notification of fraudulent documentation. Bank officials questioned the legitimacy of property sale proceeds. Dad, there seemed to be some administrative issues with the estate planning paperwork, William mentioned during a carefully casual phone call. Nothing serious, just bureaucratic complications that James apparently reported to some regulatory agencies. What kind of complications? I asked, knowing exactly what legal machinery was now investigating his criminal activity. Technical problems with document authentication, William replied, but his voice carried new tension. Richard says these issues are common with property transfers involving elderly homeowners, probably just additional verification requirements. But I could hear panic beneath his manufactured calm. When banks started questioning deposit sources, William's explanations became increasingly defensive. When title companies suspended the closing pending legal review, Carol began suggesting they might need professional legal assistance. Richard isn't responding to our calls. I overheard Carol complaining to William from my position outside their house. The real estate agent says there are irregularities in the property authorization. What if someone discovers what we actually did? William was learning that real estate fraud creates paper trails that experienced investigators can follow directly to criminal charges. And if you think the paperwork was bad, what happened next would have made anyone question their own family. What confirmed his desperation was when he suggested we take a family trip until the administrative issues resolved themselves. The night before the confrontation, I sat in my truck outside the house I'd built with my own hands, reviewing the comprehensive evidence file that would destroy William's criminal conspiracy. Tomorrow would expose his real estate fraud and end his freedom. I thought about Margaret, who'd trusted William to respect our family property after her death. She'd believed we'd raised a son who understood honesty, family loyalty, and protecting what previous generations had built through decades of hard work. The evidence revealed calculated greed that transcended normal family disputes. William had been planning to steal my home while institutionalizing me in assisted care where I'd never be able to challenge his fraud. He'd been willing to erase my independence entirely for access to property equity. William's scheme represents systematic real estate fraud involving multiple felony violations, Detective Sarah had explained during our coordination meeting. Criminal conspiracy, forged legal documents, elder financial abuse, identity theft. Tomorrow, William would discover that his elderly, supposedly confused father had been conducting a criminal investigation while he thought I was safely visiting family in another state. Some construction workers spend their careers understanding exactly how property ownership works and how to protect it from people who try to steal what isn't theirs. What gave me satisfaction was knowing that tomorrow justice would finally be ready. The confrontation came when William, Carol, and Richard arrived at my house expecting to finalize arrangements for my transition to assisted living. Their confidence was obvious as they entered carrying more fraudulent paperwork and moving company brochures. Dad, we're so relieved the administrative issues are resolved, William began, settling into the living room he thought he now owned. The property transfer is complete, and we've arranged temporary housing while you transition to the senior community Carol found. The facility is wonderful, Carol added, organizing brochures for institutions I'd never agreed to consider. Full medical support, social activities, completely managed care. You won't need to worry about maintaining this large property anymore. I looked at them calmly from my armchair, the same chair where Margaret and I had planned this house 40 years ago. Before we discuss any transitions, I said quietly, there's something important you should know about the property sale. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the legal documents James had prepared. placed them on the coffee table between us. The court order voiding their fraudulent property sale, the criminal charges filed against all three of them, the asset seizure warrant freezing the sale proceeds they'd already spent. "William," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you forgot that your father spent 40 years in construction management. I understand property law better than you understand criminal law." His face went completely white as he read the legal papers. "The house was never yours to sell," I continued. "The property transfer was fraudulent, the power of attorney was forged, and I've been watching everything from my truck across the street." Richard tried to gather his fake documents, but it was too late. Detective Sarah was already walking up my front steps. What finally ended their scheme was the moment they realized I'd been playing a completely different game. Justice came quietly when the district attorney filed comprehensive charges against William, Carol, and Richard. All three faced multiple felony counts related to real estate fraud, including forgery, identity theft, elder financial abuse, and criminal conspiracy. The defendants systematically targeted elderly homeowners across the county. The prosecutor announced during their arraignment they face 15 to 25 years in state prison. Richard's fraudulent credentials were exposed. The real estate agency lost its license. William and Carol's assets were seized to compensate their victims. 3 months later, I established a community education program working with local law enforcement to help elderly residents recognize and prevent real estate fraud. We've helped protect dozens of homeowners from similar schemes. The hardest part wasn't watching William's criminal conviction. It was knowing that Margaret would never understand how the son we'd raised with love and ethical values had become capable of stealing the home we'd built together. Sometimes the quietest justice comes from simply remembering who you are when others choose to forget. William calculated that his elderly father would be easy prey for sophisticated real estate fraud, but he'd forgotten the most important detail about his target. When William thought he'd secretly sold my house, he didn't know I was watching from my truck. He didn't know I understood property law. He didn't know I had 40 years of construction experience and legal knowledge that would expose every aspect of his criminal conspiracy. My response wasn't what he expected. My response was justice served through proper legal channels, systematic investigation, and complete prosecution. The house is still mine. William is still in prison. And every morning I wake up in the bedroom Margaret and I shared for 32 years, grateful that some things can't be stolen by people who mistake age for vulnerability. Justice stays quiet until it needs to speak. Then it speaks loud enough for everyone to hear.